Well, let's talk about the present moment. President Obama was in New Orleans yesterday. He spoke at Xavier University. Here's a snippet of what he said.
I don't have to tell you that there's still too many vacant and overgrown lots. There's still too many students attending classes in trailers. There's still too many people unable to find work. And there's still too many New Orleans folks who haven't been able to come home. So while an incredible amount of progress has been made, on this 5th anniversary, I wanted to come here and tell the people of this city directly. My administration is going to stand with you and fight alongside you until the job is done, until New Orleans is all the way back.
Tracie Washington, what's your assessment of how far New Orleans has come in the past 5 years, and how much has the Obama administration done for the recovery of New Orleans?
Well, again, thank you for having me on the show. And you know, that snippet and part of the speech by President Obama, while on the one hand is encouraging, on the other hand is also frustrating to me. We heard a promise from the government 5 years ago that we were supposed to be able to recover. We've continued to hear promises that have been broken. We should have one government in continuity, not having to worry about whether the administration is Republican or Democrat. And what we are seeing is continued blame placed on the victims of the federal government's inaction, such that we can have a president here, a president who I love, who says we see too many overgrown lots. Well, peel back the onions, peel back the layers of that, Mr. President, and understand why there are still so many overgrown lots. Because you had elderly people waiting on federal assistance after Hurricane Katrina through CDBG funding, who didn't get enough money, who could not possibly recover with $100,000 or $70,000 or whatever it is that you were going to pay them based upon the pre-Katrina value of their homes. You didn't give replacement value for homes for people who owned property, principally people in the lower Ninth Ward in Gentilly and Pontchartrain Park. And so I give that as an example to say, when you continue to make these promises, federal government, at this time, this fire next time, this 5 years, I want you to put in accountability measures so that we don't have the theft and graft and people rich in Manhattan and Long Beach and us still suffering in New Orleans because of disaster profiteers. That you ensure that our folks here in Louisiana state and locally make sure that the people who were directly victimized by inaction, by the failure of the Army Corps of Engineers to protect us, now get remedy. And finally, that those folks who are still stuck in the diaspora, who are in almost every zip code in the United States of America, are truly guaranteed the right and given free passage back to New Orleans. Because remember, we gave them a one-way ticket out. We need to make sure folks not only are welcome back, but are given a plane ride back, given a bus ride back, and ensure that they have housing when they get back here. So that's my impression. That's my frustration 5 years from now. I say this, I will continue to work because this is my home. And I love this city, but let's not put the mission accomplished banner out now, because we got a lot more work to do.
Tracie, give us some of the numbers. How many people still have been unable to return to New Orleans?
Well, look, we have 100,000 people less now than we had prior to Hurricane Katrina. Is that the right number? Probably not, because we've imported so many people, wonderful people here in the city of New Orleans that didn't live here prior to Hurricane Katrina. You know, at least 100,000 of our native folk are no longer here. Folks say, well, many of those folks who live now in Houston or Atlanta or elsewhere are having far better lives than they would have here. I give this example, however. I have a cousin, brilliant young man, and his wife who were living here in New Orleans, educators, prior to Hurricane Katrina. And yes, they are doing quite well in Houston. But when they lived in New Orleans as educators and as education administrators, their combined salary was far less than $100,000 a year, both master's degrees. They moved to Houston. They saw their standard of living increase dramatically. But what frustrates them is that they said, look, Tracie, now we see young Caucasian non-educators were able to come into our positions that we should have rightfully had, making far more money than we ever made in New Orleans. Are they happy in Houston? Will they stay in Houston? Absolutely. But there's still that frustration and a bit of anger that they weren't afforded the opportunity to return home and make the standard of living and the kind of living they deserved. So, you know, folks want to play with numbers. I won't play with numbers. I play with lives. I don't play with lives, but we talk about lives and we say, that's what I want folks to focus in on.
Well, Tracie Washington, civil rights attorney and president of the Louisiana Justice Institute, will be back in a minute. We're joined now by two guests from New Orleans. Jordan Flaherty is a New Orleans-based writer and community organizer. His book is Floodlines, Community and Resistance from Katrina to the Jena Six. We're also joined by Tracie Washington, civil rights attorney and president of the Louisiana Justice Institute. Jordan, in your book, Floodlines, you tell many, many stories of communities surviving and resisting in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Talk about what happened to the education system in New Orleans.
Well, the education system certainly had problems before Katrina. As Tracie talked about, the teachers were not paid well. The system was tragically underfunded. It was not a working system. But what happened after Katrina is you had a complete shift in the system. So pre-Katrina, you had 128 schools. 124 of them were under the control of the school board. After the storm, the first thing that happened was the entire staff of the school system was fired. All the teachers, janitors, cafeteria workers, 7,000 plus employees were fired. Their union, which was the largest union in the city, was de-recognized. It was also probably the largest source of black political power in the city. It ceased to exist. The schools were then taken away from the control of the school board, so that now there's 5 schools under the school board, and the rest are under a combination of either the state or various charters. So we have this, what Superintendent Paul Vallis has called this 100% choice system, what he proudly calls a free market system. And that, I think, is a microcosm of what we've seen in all these aspects of the post-Katrina New Orleans, where it's this survival of the fittest system. We do have excellent schools in the city now, but you need to have parents that can go out and research and get their applications in and get you into the right schools. We have some great health care available, but there's no one health care system that provides free health care for indigent folks. That's been taken away. So we have some wonderful housing available, but it costs a lot more now. And if you live in a home that was damaged, if you lived in a white neighborhood, you got the full amount of money to rebuild. If you lived in an African-American neighborhood, you didn't get the money community rebuilt. So it's this survival of fittest. If you lived in the French Quarter or the Central Business District, or you go to the Lower Garden District, those areas were very quickly rebuilt, even though they didn't flood. You go to the Lower Ninth Ward, these areas that were hit the most, Gentilly, New Orleans East, they still haven't recovered. So it's like the recovery support went to those that needed the least. And that's, I think, fundamentally what we've seen as a problem with this whole recovery. And that's why I think there's important lessons for people to learn around the country from New Orleans, not just if you're scared of a hurricane, but if you're concerned about any of these issues: housing, healthcare, criminal justice, education. Because we saw these issues in New Orleans, but we saw them played out on hyperspeed, on fast speed. Suddenly all the teachers fired. Suddenly all the public housing closed up and shuttered up and the people not allowed back in. Suddenly all the schools taken away from local control and put under state control and transferred over to this charter system. Virtually overnight these changes happened. But I think there's a lot to learn, not just from the problems, but also from the solutions, from this organizing that people did here in New Orleans. And I talked a little bit ago about what happened on criminal justice organizing, but there's incredible organizing that's happened from people working on these issues of housing and education, people that have fought for a just reconstruction of the city, people like Tracie Washington, culture workers that have been organizing on the front lines like Sonny Patterson, who have been doing amazing cultural work and have also been community organizers, folks like Cess 45, who have been not just participating in the events but organizing a lot of this response. And so there's important positive lessons, I think, for people around the country concerned about these issues to learn from.
Jordan, in a recent article you wrote, you cite a statistic from the recent survey of New Orleanians by the Kaiser Family Foundation about the racial disparity in terms of understandings of recovery. 42% of African Americans versus just 16% of whites say they have still not recovered from Hurricane Katrina. Tracie Washington, we just got a few minutes left with you. You've talked about the right to recovery as opposed to recovery as a privilege. Explain what you mean.
Especially here, and following, I guess, a little bit on what Jordan was saying, this right to recovery really evolves from United Nations principles, but it is embodied in sort of the type of economy and how we lived here in New Orleans and really all along the Gulf Coast. We had a social services infrastructure in place here that supplemented health care and education and transportation because we worked people poor, right? We had so many low-wage workers, and we were an impoverished city. Granted, we had lots of wealthy people here, but those wealthy people really made money off of the labor of poor folk. We took away the entire social services infrastructure, but still expected people to work poor and live really poor, except now it was much more difficult. When we talk, therefore, about a right to recovery, we mean principally that the folks who were here prior to Katrina, those folks who were worked poor, all of us really have a right to be returned, not just to where we were prior to Hurricane Katrina, but we have those same rights principally to education, to housing, to health care, to voting, right? All of these things should be human rights for us, and they've not been restored. And for so many of us who are principled and moral, and so many activists, all of whom I couldn't possibly name here, we sit and we look in these faces every day. We look at these children who are being horribly underserved and undereducated, and we don't say just 365 days from now, but what's going to happen 3 years from now and 36 years from now? What's going to happen with their lives? And if we simply take the time to have a principled recovery based on these rights, basic human rights, we would be so much better off, and in fact, we would be that model city that the president, our governor, our mayor, and our senior senator continue to falsely say we are. We are not there yet, but we can get there.
Well, Tracie Washington, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, president of the Louisiana Justice Institute. We're going to turn now to